So, good afternoon. This is one of the meetings for the La Frontiera meeting. Benjamin Friedman is one of the most important economists. He has been a teacher at the University of Harvard. He used to be the president of the Department of Economics, but he's also a very practical person who worked as an advisor for Morgan Stanley, for the Federal Reserve, and he's a member of the committee of the Britannica. He's a great American, and he is a person who can really go beyond the borders of economics with a wider approach as a discipline of society, following the political economics of Ricardo and Smith. One of the most important texts translated into Italian, which you can buy at the entrance of this wonderful Renaissance being, ethical value of growth. He reconciles economics and literature. He quotes Fitzgerald more than Adam Smith. This is to say that the focus and the heart of his lecture is devoted to ethics. Ethics in the widest sense, civil, political, social ethics. So the gist of the presentation is the idea that advanced economic development characterizing human societies can pave the way to a more open, tolerant and democratic society. Talking about one of the most important issues of this discussion, the one stating that growth, on the contrary, creates social discomfort and disintegration in society. And it's exactly the opposite, as Professor Friedman will demonstrate. So economic growth is a key element for the well-being, and this is demonstrated by what's happening in the Italian society, to generate communities where opening, tolerance and democracy become one of the most central and wisest aspects. So the floor to you.
Thank you very much for that extremely warm and very generous introduction, and I thank also the organizers of this meeting for having given me the opportunity to come and speak to such a distinguished audience and also in such a lovely place. It's always very daunting for Americans to come to lovely places like this in Europe and be made consciously and visibly aware of how young our society is and how much in the way of grandeur and tradition went before us. And this splendid place is a very living memory and reminder of that fact. The question that I would like to address with you this afternoon is one that I would hope would be of primary interest to any economist or anyone interested in economics. That is to say, what is it that economics, and especially economic performance, and behind the economic performance, economic policy, has to contribute to the general welfare of our societies? Most of economics is either microeconomics, by which we mean studies of efficiency. In other words, how can we produce and distribute and consume in such a way as to lead firms to be as close as possible to their existing frontier of available production, and households to exist as close as possible to their frontier of utility that is possible. And in macroeconomics, we also have studies that are oriented toward keeping the economy as a whole as close as possible to the frontier, mostly by the use of monetary and fiscal policy. And also in macroeconomics, we're interested in what policies the public authority might take to expand the frontier over time. We think of this as growth policy. And clearly, if we look at the mood of the body politic in either your country or my own, we discover that failures of economic policy to deliver the kinds of economic performance, either in the short or in the long run, that the public requires are taken very, very seriously. But the question I want to address is why we place this great an emphasis on the efficiency aspect of staying close to the frontier, and especially why we place such emphasis on policies and performance oriented toward expanding the frontier over time. Now, the very first thing to say is that if we were among, perhaps 4/5 of the world's population, the answer to this question that I'm posing would be both immediate and obvious, because across the great majority of the distribution of income in the world, improvements in material living standards, economic growth as we call it, translates immediately and directly into improvements in such human basics as how long people live, what diseases they suffer from, how many of their children die in infancy, how many of their adult fellow citizens are malnourished, and so forth. But the truth of the matter is that long before a society reaches the material standard of living that you in Italy enjoy or that we in the United States enjoy, virtually all of these connections between increasing material living standards and improvements in the human basics have pretty much played themselves out. So to pick one country that happens to be familiar to me, and maybe many of you have visited it, South Korea. South Korea has a living standard in material terms that's approximately half of ours in the United States. The Koreans live just as long as we do in the United States, which is to say almost as long as Italians live. We in the United States do not enjoy quite the life expectancy that Italians have, but the Koreans live just as long as we do. Their morbidity experience is essentially identical to ours. It's embarrassing for an American to admit it, but in Korea, with, again, half of our standard of living, the infant mortality rate is lower than ours in the United States. So it's very clear that the improvement from a standard of living like Korea's to a standard of living like ours in the United States, or yours in Italy, would not bear on these basic human dimensions of life. To take another country that's even closer at hand, right across the Adriatic, not long ago I went to a conference in Croatia, so I looked up the statistics for Croatia. Croatia has a standard of living, approximately 1/3 of what you enjoy here in Italy. But even the Croatians have a life expectancy almost as long as ours. Even the Croatians have a lower rate of infant mortality than we do in the United States. So I return to the question, for a rich country on the planet like mine or like yours, in which we live on a material level that is not only so much greater than what most of the population of the world enjoys, but far, far above anything that our ancestors of 100 years ago could have imagined, why is it that we place such great emphasis on economic growth? And as a moral question, are we right to do so? Is there something that justifies the kind of emphasis that we place in our value structure on economic performance? And is there something that justifies, again, as a moral concern, the kind of importance we attach to economic policies that intervene in the economic growth process, either for good or bad? The answer I would like to suggest to you this afternoon goes beyond the scope of economics narrowly construed. It is that when the broad cross-section of a society's population are enjoying an improvement in their material standard of living, and further, when they have some confidence that that improvement will continue into the future, and even some degree of optimism that that improvement will be enjoyed further on by their children, that is the condition under which in most societies that we see around the world, people also exhibit characteristics that Western society has interpreted not merely as positive, but as morally positive ever since the Enlightenment of the 18th century. Let me be specific. First, I have in mind openness of opportunity. A crucial test for any society, yours, mine, any, is whether the young people who are given an opportunity to get ahead are merely the sons and daughters and the nieces and nephews of those who have already occupied the highest places in the society, or whether opportunity is made available more broadly. My argument today is that when the bulk of the society is enjoying an increase in its material standard of living, this is the condition under which the society not only can afford to make opportunities available more broadly, but actually does so. Second, I have in mind tolerance. Tolerance is a very particular, a very parochial concept. As an American, as I'll make clear in due course, I think of tolerance in terms of race relations. As an American, I think of tolerance in terms of attitudes toward immigrants. As an American, I think of tolerance in terms of religious prejudice. I am aware that all of these factors play some role in European society, though in very different ways and perhaps to different extents than they do in my own. The argument I want to make is that when the majority of a society's citizenry is enjoying an improvement in its material standard of living, that is the condition under which, more often than not, people will also be inclined toward acceptance and tolerance of people who are different from themselves. Third, I have in mind fairness in the sense not just of distributive justice, but also of generosity toward those whom the economic process leaves behind. After all, we all are aware that it's all very well and good to provide opportunity, but inevitably there will be people who, for one reason or another, simply are not able to take advantage of the opportunities that a market society provides. And what then? What provision does the society make for them? My argument is that when the broad majority of a society's citizens are enjoying an increase in their material living standard and are optimistic about that improvement continuing into the future, then they are more likely to be willing to share part of what they have with those who are less fortunate. And finally, I have in mind a commitment to democracy, which in a country like Italy or my country means the nurturing and preservation of our democratic political institutions and freedoms, but in many countries around the world doesn't mean that at all, but rather means the creation anew of completely new innovations in political structure and freedom that a country has not known before. Here again, the hypothesis is that when the broad bulk of a society's citizenry enjoys an increase in its material standard of living, that society's commitment to either preserving the democracy that it already has or building a new set of democratic institutions will be heightened. Now, as I hope people are well aware, economists, me included, are very reluctant merely to posit a hypothesis without having some kind of material behavioral story behind it. In the interest of time, I'll only sketch the model very briefly that stands behind this hypothesis, because I want to spend most of my time elaborating several key implications of this hypothesis, if it is indeed true. But in brief, the model has three elements, two of which we find enormous support for in the empirical evidence, and then the third that is simply an assumption. The first piece of the model for which we have ample empirical evidence is that when people consider how well off they are, most of the time they think of this as a matter of relative incomes and relative consumption standards, where the benchmark that they immediately have in mind is how well they and their families have lived in the past. So the first part of the model is a kind of habit formation argument of utility in which people feel better off by living better than they or their families have in the past. And conversely, people whose material living standard falls below their prior standard or their family's standard feel that they are not doing well. The second element, for which we also have ample empirical support, is that people, in addition to comparing their current living standard to what they and their families have known in the past, also derive utility from living better than people against whom they compare themselves contemporaneously. Perhaps their fellow workers, perhaps their friends, perhaps their neighbors. Once again, there's an enormous body of empirical evidence for this phenomenon. Now, if we have two arguments in a utility function, we have to decide whether these two arguments are substitutes or complements in the standard mode of consumer demand theory, namely, if I have just eaten a piece of apple pie, does this make me more or less eager to have a cup of coffee? Probably more equal, and therefore this makes coffee and apple pie substitutes. And conversely, if I've just had a cup of coffee, does this make me more or less eager to have a cup of tea? Probably less eager. So this makes coffee and tea substitutes instead of complements. The crucial assumption then, that is the third element of the model behind the hypotheses I'm explaining, is that these two sources of utility, one from living better than other people around me, and the other from living better than I or my family lived in the past, are substitutes for one another, not complements. As a result, if I see that I'm living better than people around me, this reduces the urgency that I associate with living better than I or my family did in the past. Well, of course, it's impossible for everyone, or even for a majority of people, to live better than everybody else around them. By contrast, what is possible is for the majority of people to live better than they or their families have lived in the past. And if these two sources of utility are substitutes for one another, when they do, the awareness that they are living better than they lived in the past reduces the urgency that people attach to living better than other people around them. So the core of the model is that under economic growth, by which I mean sustained improvements in living standards broadly distributed across the population, people's urgency of living better than others around them is reduced, and therefore many of the kinds of behaviors that grow out of the competitive desire to live better than other people are in turn sublimated compared to other objectives for the society. Now, I'd like to spend the remainder of my allotted time by elaborating 4 implications of these hypotheses if they are true. The first is a very positive one. If I'm right that what stands behind a society's tolerance and generosity and commitment to democracy is not just how rich people are, but whether they have a sense of moving ahead in their lives, then the implication is that many countries around the world where incomes are far below ours in the United States or yours in Italy will not have to wait until they achieve Western levels of income and Western living standards before they begin to democratize with a small d and liberalize with a small l. I mentioned South Korea a moment ago. Incidentally, I'm not sure how many people here are aware that when the Korean Peninsula was partitioned at the end of World War II, what became South Korea was the poor agricultural part of the peninsula. Such industry as there was primarily located in the north, which as a consequence was richer than South Korea. That incidentally is the clearest demonstration I know that in economics it's possible to make first magnitude mistakes that have consequences that go on for generations. But my objective at the moment is not to talk about North Korea, but rather South Korea. South Korea, when the country was formed in 1946, had a standard of living that by Western standards, even then, was pretty much negligible. Beginning in the 1960s and continuing up through the middle of the 1980s, the Koreans underwent a quite remarkable economic transformation that took their standard of living up to about, at that point, a third of what ours was in the United States. It's also then the case that when South Korea was newly formed as a nation in the late 1940s, the country was, to call it what it was, a one-party military dictatorship under General Syngman Rhee. And this continued to be the case for about a decade or two, but beginning in the late 1960s and going up through the early 1990s, South Korea also underwent a quite remarkable political transformation that took the country from being a one-party military dictatorship to what it is today, namely a well-developed political democracy in which there is genuine competition for the levers of power and in which the standard Western freedoms, freedom of assembly, freedom of political action, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, are widely recognized. My argument is that it is not an accident that South Korea underwent this 25-year or so political transformation with some lag after its economic transformation. And I think many countries around the world, even including China, which by coincidence is the country in the developing world that I know best, will in due course evolve in that direction. When I first visited China more than 25 years ago, people there had no freedom to choose where to work, no freedom to choose whether to work, could not choose where to live, could not hire anybody to work for them, could not start a business. Today, with the exception of the freedom of where to live, all those freedoms are broadly enjoyed in China, and in 11 of the provinces, the hukou restrictions that limit where people are allowed to live have all been removed. China today, at the village level, is moving in the direction of democracy. China now does have contested elections at the village level, and mind, in a country with more than 700,000 villages, this is not a small matter. But today, China at the national level is still non-democratic. But my hypothesis suggests that if the Chinese continue to move in the direction in which they have been moving economically, with the greatest sustained increase in living standards over the last quarter century that the Western or any other world has ever seen, then I think it's clear that the Chinese also, even at the national level, will move in the direction of some form of liberalization and democratization, which does not necessarily mean that their form of liberal democracy will look like ours in the United States or yours in Italy. That's not the point. The point is that some liberalization and democratization, I think, will occur. Now, this may sound optimistic, and if so, that's because it is optimistic. The line of thinking that I'm developing with you that runs from scientific progress, or progress in knowledge, as we would call it today, to economic progress, to political, social, and ultimately moral progress, is very much a form of Enlightenment thinking, which always had as its basis a kind of fundamental optimism about the human enterprise. Now, economics itself as a discipline was, of course, a product of Enlightenment thinking. But as we're all aware, sometime in the 19th century, somewhere between Malthus and Ricardo and Mill and Marx, economics took a different path and became the dismal science. But I would argue with some vigor that the objective circumstances to which Malthus and Mill and Marx and Ricardo were all responding do not describe the world in which we live today. And I think the time may well have arrived for economics to cease being the dismal science and to reclaim the kind of optimism about the human enterprise that is, after all, the birthright of our discipline as a product originally of Enlightenment thinking. The second implication of the hypothesis that I want to develop with you this afternoon is, however, more sobering. If I'm right that what matters for things like tolerance and fairness and democracy is not just how rich a society is, but whether the broad bulk of the population is moving forward, then it's very sobering to realize, either in the United States or in Italy, for that matter, that the broad bulk of the population is not, these days, particularly moving forward. In my country, for example, the median family income in 2006, which is the most recent year for which we have median income data, was below where it was at the beginning of the decade. The family right in the middle of my country's income distribution has lost ground, after allowing for inflation, throughout this decade. Italy is a similar story. The nice people at the Banca d'Italia were kind enough to give me data on median incomes, and what I can tell you is that in 1989, the median household income in Italy, this is in 2000, year 2000 euro equivalents, was 22,500 euros. As recently as 2004, the median household income in Italy was 21,700. So as recently as 2004, the median household income here had actually fallen over a 15-year period. And the most recent year for which the Banca d'Italia had data, at least as of a week ago, was 2006, in which finally, the median income here rose above where it was in 1989. To recall, 1989, stated in 2,000 euros, was 22,500, and in 2006, that's 17 years later, the median income was 22,700. So the entire gain, not per annum, but the entire gain in 17 years has been barely 1%. Now, this phenomenon has had a number of consequences. I read with great interest the article that Professor Tito Boeri and also Andrea Brandolini from the Banca d'Italia wrote, titled "The Age of Discontent." And quoting from part of what they write. They write about the malaise of the Italian middle class, which they attribute to, and here again I'm quoting, disillusionment and frustration generated by the uncertainty of their children's future. This is Italy, but the same could be said, and it has often been said about the United States as well. Now, what are some of the manifestations that history tells us might emerge if we continue, either in your country or mine, in this direction in which the majority of the population is not enjoying any increase in its standard of living? To repeat from before, I think the answer is a movement away from the kind of society that Enlightenment thinking has led us to attribute as positive in the moral sphere. A movement away from tolerance, democracy, generosity, fairness, mobility, openness of opportunity. Let me give you just one example from my own country's experience, which may or may not resonate with issues that are current here in Italy. As you may know, the United States has always been a country of immigrants. The country was founded originally by immigrants, and immigration has always been a large part of the American society and the American economy. As you might also guess, however, attitudes toward new immigrants among the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those who came before have exhibited a fair amount of ebb and flow over the years. So consider the following sequence of events that roughly describes the evolution of American attitudes toward immigrants going back to the first great wave of immigration after America was a new country. We had in the United States in the 1840s and especially the 1850s a wave of outright violence against immigrants. These were primarily German immigrants at the time, although some Irish as well. In the 1860s and 1870s, that violence went away. It simply disappeared, and immigrants were welcomed and used for labor, and many of them got ahead economically. Things changed in the 1880s and 1890s. Again, there were large numbers of immigrants in the 1880s and 1890s, many of them incidentally from Italy. But there was a return at that time, not of violence, but of really very ugly anti-immigrant agitation. Things changed again after the turn of the 20th century, in which, again, immigration, including from Italy, continued to be extremely large. America was, at that time, receiving well over 1 million new immigrants a year on a population of less than 100 million total. So this is in immigration equal to more than 1% of the population per year. But throughout this period, in the early decades of the 20th century, the attitude was to welcome and to use the vocabulary of the day to Americanize the immigrants. Things changed again in the 1920s and on into the 1930s when the United States put in place not only the numerically most restrictive, but also the most discriminatory immigration legislation that my country has ever known. The crucial piece of legislation was the so-called National Origins Act of 1924. What national origins meant was that the ease with which you could come to the United States depended on your national origin, even within Europe. So that if you were coming from Britain or the north of Germany, that was okay, and there were ample quotas. If you were coming from the south of Germany or from Italy, that became very difficult. If you were coming from Greece or the Balkans, that became extremely difficult. If you were coming from Poland or the western frontier of the Russian Empire, this became more difficult still. It is impossible to look at the specification of the quotas under the 1924 Act and not see written very clearly the religious map of Western Europe. The reason for the quotas was that in northern Germany and in Britain, they were primarily Protestants. In southern Germany and Italy, they were primarily Roman Catholics. Moving to the east in the Balkans, they were primarily Eastern Orthodox, and moving up into the western fringes of the Russian Empire, they were primarily Jews who were emigrating. This was the characteristic of American immigration policy from 1924 onward for fully 40 years. This system was thrown out in the 1960s and replaced by a much more liberalized system in which national origins basically had nothing to do with it, and issues like family unification, political asylum, and other more humanitarian reasons for immigrating became much more the fore. Then, beginning in the 1980s and on into the 1990s, we started to see pushback against immigration again, including movements in high immigration states like Florida and California and Texas to deny various kinds of public benefits, even to legal immigrants who had emigrated through the official channels. And then, miraculously, all this went away in the course of the 1990s, so that the one candidate, there was only one candidate in the year 2000 who chose to run for President of the United States on an explicitly anti-immigrant platform, namely Pat Buchanan. And he got so few votes, even in the Republican Party primaries, that he had to change parties before the primary season was over. And now here we are again in 2008, and it's clear that immigration is again the most bitterly contentious domestic policy issue that we face. Now, it would be foolish to pretend, and I'm not going to pretend, that every little twist and turn of this 160, 170-year experience of American attitudes toward immigrants was narrowly or deterministically driven by the underlying ebb and flow of economic progress and stagnation. But I think it would be even more foolish to look at the evidence and pretend that economic stagnation versus prosperity had nothing to do with it. And when you look at the evidence again and again and again, whether the issue is immigrants or race relations or opportunities for women or generosity to the poor, religious prejudice, again and again and again, the same pattern emerges. Even the most fundamental aspects, at least in my country, of the democratic political system. Ask questions like, when did women get the vote in my country? When did blacks get the vote in my country? When did blacks really get the vote in my country? After all, one of the anomalies of the American historical experience is that there was a 95-year gap between the de jure granting of the franchise to black citizens and the effectuation of that right to vote. Again and again and again, no matter which one of these issues you choose, you cannot come away with a sense that while there are exceptions, the predominant tendency is for the society to move in directions that we would take to be morally positive in the Enlightenment sense when the majority of the citizens are enjoying an increase in their standard of living and have confidence that it will continue. And conversely, not just in the United States, but in many countries around the world, when people lose this sense of forward progress in their material living standard, and moreover have no confidence that it will return or that even their children after them will see an improvement, that is the condition under which not only is there no progress in this moral sphere, but all too often the consequences are rigidification, retrenchment, retreat, sometimes with truly catastrophic results. And all of this, I think, is extremely daunting and sobering, either given the pace of improvement, which is negative in the United States for the majority of families, or given the pace of improvement in Italy, which is very, very small. Now, before finishing, let me highlight briefly two further implications of this hypothesis that's true. One is a sharp implication for economic policy. We often hear that in matters of economics, and in particular in matters relating to things like economic growth, the best stance for public policy is simply to stand back, to do as little as possible, and to let the market mechanism perform its magic. And through this marvelous procedure that those of us in the room who are economics professors take delight in explaining to new students year after year, the families will decide how much they want to save, and the businesses will decide how much they want to invest, and the intersection of the aggregate of what the families save and what the businesses invest will deliver up an aggregate investment rate for the economy, and that will have something to do with the aggregate rate of productivity growth, and that will have something to do with the aggregate rate of wage growth, and that in turn will determine for the majority of the population the improvement in the standard of living. A sharp implication of the hypothesis that I'm elaborating this afternoon is that that line of thinking is false. The optimal rate of economic growth is not identical to this market rate of economic market determined rate, but different from, in particular, faster than the market determined growth rate. And the reason basically is an externality argument. If it's true, as I'm suggesting, that economic growth brings these additional moral benefits, generosity, democracy, fairness, tolerance, then we have to realize that there is no reason for either the individual families deciding how much to save or the individual businesses deciding how much to invest to take those externalities into account in their internal economic decision making. And therefore, for reasons that are exactly analogous to the reasons why the market left to its own devices over-provides things like pollution and noise and congestion, the market left to its own devices would under-provide the economic growth that delivers tolerance and democracy and fairness. After all, there is no market where we can get a bid-ask price for tolerance. There is no place to get a contract or find a price or get even a shadow price on democracy. And therefore, if we value these aspects of our society, which for 250 years we've been doing, and if it's true that they are, at least in part, byproducts of improvement in material standards of living, then it's appropriate for economic policy to pursue pathways that cause the growth rate of median incomes and the incomes of the majority of the population to be faster than they otherwise would have. Now, to say the obvious, if the only ways that we knew to make our economy grow faster were to take steps that were somehow inimical to or that undermined the fairness and democratic character of the society, then of course it would make no sense whatsoever to say that our objective is to achieve improvement in these moral dimensions, but we're going to do that by economic policies that undermine those moral dimensions. That would be absolutely foolish. But I would argue very strongly that certainly for my country, and I would suspect for Italy and other European countries as well, there is no lack no lack of policy instruments that we can pursue that at the very least would be able to spur economic growth without undermining the democratic and tolerant character of the society, and that in many ways offer a kind of win-win situation by simultaneously making the economy grow faster and also fostering a more democratic, fairer structure of the economy, and that's exactly what we should do. The final implication of the hypothesis that I'm advancing to you this afternoon is, I think, the most fundamental one of all. If I'm right about the connection between rising standards of living and these moral characteristics of the society, then I think certainly in my country, and I suspect here as well, we need to change the way in which we conduct our public conversation about economic growth and also about economic policies that are either conducive to or inimical to economic growth. What I have in mind is this. Over the course of the past several decades, we have become increasingly aware of the negative aspects of various manifestations of the growth process, like industrialization and growth through globalization, to which we have appropriately attached a moral overtone. I have in mind especially environmental degradation, but there are others as well. Because of our increasing sensitivity to these drawbacks of the economic growth process, the customary way in which people in the public sphere discuss economic growth today rests on the assumption that economic growth, of course, brings material benefits. That's part of the definition of growth. But that to the extent that there are moral dimensions, they're entirely on the negative side. And therefore, the debate over growth and growth-related policies is one of weighing material benefits versus moral negatives. And people even come away from this conversation with the view that their self-image of where do I stand? Am I a person who mostly places emphasis on the material aspects of life, or by contrast, am I someone who more heavily values moral considerations, that their sense of themselves on this material moral spectrum then maps neatly into where they should be in the growth conversation. People who see themselves as being more interested in material concerns then naturally think they're supposed to be in favor of economic growth and growth-oriented policies, and conversely, people who think of themselves as being more interested in moral concerns think that therefore they are supposed to be opposed to economic growth and resist policies that would be conducive to growth. The hypothesis I've been developing with you for the past hour suggests that this too is a wrong way of carrying out the conversation. If I'm right about the connection between rising incomes and tolerance and fairness and opportunity and democracy, then it simply is not true that all of the benefits of the moral kind are elsewhere, and that the benefits of growth are entirely material. Then it's then true that economic growth has very important moral positive benefits as well, and to repeat, benefits that Western thinking for the past quarter of a millennium has recognized as positive and taken to be morally positive. And similarly, it is not true that the mapping from one's position on the material versus moral values scale should translate into where one should be in growth debates. I think if we can manage to change our public conversation about economic growth to take into account these very important moral positives of growth, we will not only be getting it right intellectually, which of course is always important, but in many countries around the world, certainly I believe it's true in mine, I suspect it's true here as well, in many countries around the world, getting the public conversation right is likely in time to lead to the adoption of policies which will indeed restore genuine economic growth and put these countries back on the path to a morally positive trajectory. Thank you very much.
Moltissime grazie.
Thank you very much, Professor Friedman. That was a very interesting speech demonstrating that we were talking about frontier issue and the attempt to compare the economies of some Western countries, the US and Italy, and some considerations on the ethical and moral dimensions. Started from the rational expectations and some pioneering studies on fiscal and monetary policies was very much elaborated. We really appreciate and congratulate you for your moderate optimism, which we very badly need in this country. So we'll work on a one-to-one basis, so we'll have one question and one answer.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I think that we would agree in general terms that the economic growth goes, well, let's say, hand in hand with advancement also on the moral side. It seems to me that your talk was mostly focused on, let's say, a macro view of this argument. I would be interested to hear your comments about the micro view. So, for example, if we assume that we compare democratic societies and the morals in societies where there is some level of economic growth. So it seems to me that it's also a question of how the wealth is distributed within the society, right? So apart from looking at the average, at some kind of level of economic growth, it seems to me that the actual distribution makes also a difference. So I would like your comment on that. And for example, I could think of some kind of comparison between, let's say, USA and Canada, which I think there are some differences there. Thank you.
Let me very much thank you for the question. I certainly agree with you that distribution matters, and I hope people were sensitive to the fact that when I was quoting income data before, both for the United States and Italy, for precisely the reason that you were suggesting, what I was quoting were median incomes, not mean incomes. And of course, if the distribution remains unchanged, then the relationship between the mean and the median remains unchanged. But exactly in line with what you were suggesting, at least I think my country is more clear-cut than Italy these days. But in the United States, the reason for the stagnation of median incomes in the current decade, and even going back some further, has to do with distribution. In the 6-year period for which we have data since the beginning of this decade, in which, to repeat, the median family income in the United States has gone down, the mean income has improved rather nicely. The mean income has gone up by about 1.5% per annum, which is not like China, to be sure, but by the standards of an advanced country like the United States is not all bad. Now, why is it that the mean is rising at a very healthy rate for an advanced economy, but the median is not just stagnating but going down, the answer is just what you point to. It's distribution. So the fact that the aggregate economic production, the incremental production, is accruing to only a very small part of the population means that the majority of the population is not enjoying an increase in its standard of living. So distribution is clearly involved in the connection between growth in the sense of what's measured in the GDP statistics and whether the average person, meaning the person at the 50th percentile of the income distribution, is enjoying an increase or not. So in that sense, I certainly agree with you. Now, it is also possible that distribution, even if not changing, matters. So you pointed, for example, to the difference between the United States and Canada. Canada has a Gini coefficient in the low 30s. We now have a Gini coefficient that's about 40. Latin American countries tend to be in the 50 or 60 range. Asian countries tend to be back in the 30s or even below. It is entirely possible that there's a second tier of what drives these phenomena that I have not explored, that has to do with the level of the income distribution, even if static, but my hypothesis is separate from that. So my hypothesis does not exclude, does not preclude such an effect, but it does not rest on it. So there's a sense in which the income distribution, if changing, is crucial to my line of argument. Then there's a second possibility, which I took to be behind what you had in mind in the US-Canada comparison, which is not part of my model, but could be there or not, and I've simply not worked on that.
So you consider them independent for the time being, if I get this right? For your model, I mean.
I could imagine interactions as well, so I wouldn't want to go as far. It's simply not something. It's not a direction in which I've taken the work, but I hesitate to jump to the conclusion that they're independent. I can imagine stories in which once that additional effect or mechanism is put into the model, and we know how to do that, then there could be interesting interaction forms, and I wouldn't want to exclude that either. It's just not a direction in which I've taken the research.
Thank you.
Chiedo scusa, vi chiederei la cortesia di presentarvi, cosa che mi è sfuggita.
Will you please introduce yourselves?
Faccio la domanda in italiano. Vorrei sapere se professore può darci un esempio.
Can you make an example, just one country, might be Scandinavian countries where the distribution used to be and still is very high, but there have been phenomena of uncertainty, growth of pessimism. Can you think of a country like that?
Yes, to repeat, European countries, not just Scandinavia, but European countries in general have much more egalitarian income distributions than the United States, and this has been true for a very long time, as I understand it. In my work, I've focused on the historical experience of 3 European countries. One is Britain, which I've studied since basically since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Second is France, for which I've looked at the experience since the founding of the Third Republic in 1870. And third is Germany, which I've studied for the period since the unification of the German Empire in 1871. And as is the case for the United States, what my work shows is that the overwhelmingly predominant tendency in each of these three countries is for positive movements in tolerance and democratic structures, in generosity to the poor, this sort of thing, to evolve at a time when the majority of the population is enjoying an increase in its standard of living, and for the opposite to be true when people's incomes are by and large stagnant. Now, to repeat, these are countries that have traditionally had, at least certainly within the 20th century, more egalitarian income distributions than the United States. And so if it were the case that having an egalitarian income distribution were a sufficient condition to render the hypothesis I've been describing inoperative, then I think that would have shown up in a contrast between the experience of the European countries I studied and the experience of the United States. Now, to be clear, I've only studied 3 countries, and you know, one has a finite lifetime, and so a positive outcome would be that people in other countries would decide to carry out this line of research for countries that, not only that I didn't have time to include in my book, but for which I wouldn't have the historical knowledge in order to do it. Getting the economics straight is pretty straightforward for a trained economist. Getting the politics straight is very difficult. And there are many, many countries that would be interesting to study that I wouldn't even attempt to do myself because I don't have that expertise, but many other people do. And so I would encourage anyone who would like to write something testing this hypothesis to Italy, for example. I think that would be a splendid idea, but I'm not capable of doing it.
Grazie, chiedo scusa, non mi sono presentato. Mario Margiocco, sono un giornalista.
My name is Mario Margiocco, journalist of the Sole 24 Ore.
C'è qualcun altro? Sì, una mano alzata.
Thank you. I have some problems with your thesis. Most scholars who study the connection between happiness and per capita income have come to the conclusion that there is no connection at all. And therefore I think it's hard to argue that such things as tolerance or commitment to democracy and all these things are more closely connected with per capita growth than happiness is. Probably one point which may show that it is hard to connect per capita income growth and all these things you mentioned has put forward by an English economist, a late English economist, Fred Hirsch. He wrote several years ago, many years ago, a book, Social Limitations of Growth. And his main point was that there exist not only material goods, but positional goods, as he called it, too. And the specificity of these positional goods are that they cannot be enlarged without limits, that they are, you cannot promise everybody to get a nice piece of land at the Lago di Garda, for example. Therefore, growth cannot offer the enlargement of all goods, including positional goods. And I think this is an important point which should be discussed. Thank you.
I'm puzzled that you think of this evidence as being counter to the hypothesis that I've outlined or to the model, because I think of it as being exactly part of the argument in favor of the model, including the Hirsch argument, with which I'm very sympathetic. So let me restate, because maybe I wasn't as sharp as I should have been. There's no argument in my model, repeat, no argument in my model that the absolute level of income has anything to do with anyone's utility. The reason for this is exactly as you say, that repeated studies in the so-called happiness literature, and we're in Italy, and Italian economists have been absolutely at the forefront of this line of work within the last 10, 15 years. So I assume this is well known here. Just as you say, there is little, if any, evidence that absolute income levels matter for individual utilities. What then does matter for utilities? One piece of evidence is the habit formation argument that I emphasized, namely, are people living better now than they were before? And then second is the argument that you're identifying with Fred Hirsch, and I, in my book, also draw on Hirsch's work because I took it to be, and take it to be, very supportive. Hirsch's idea is about living better than other people, and he rightly pointed out that not all of the ways in which we care about our status or well-being compared to other people have to do with material things. He pointed out that many aspects of what people care about are positional in the sense that in effect, they're rationed not by a deliberate rationing process, but by the very structure. So in a competitive setting, only some certain number of people can be at the top of the class, or the Olympics will be this summer and only one person will win the gold medal in each event, and so on and so forth. But this is exactly what underlies the second argument in the utility function in my model, namely people's caring about living better than other people. So there is no argument in this utility function that has anything whatsoever to do with the, as you put it, per capita income or the absolute level of income. The utility function has two arguments. One is about the relative comparison of the individual's living standard today to what it was in the past, or what the person's family was in the past. And the second, which is the one that connects very directly to the Hirsch book, which is a wonderful book, is about people's comparing their position versus other people. And then, as I said before, then the crucial issue is whether these two arguments in the utility function are substitutes or complements in the sense of having a positive or a negative cross derivative in the Jacobian. That's what it's about. But I just don't see anything that's contradicted by the fact that, as you correctly say, the happiness literature turns up little, if any, evidence that absolute incomes matter. And indeed, it is precisely that finding that leads one not exactly to my model. There are many models one could have, but it's precisely that fact, that empirical finding that you correctly quote, that leads in the direction of looking for the arguments of the utility function to be in relative rather than absolute form, and that's what leads to my model. So I just don't see a contradiction there.
Se non ci sono altre domande, approfitto del microfono e rivolgo.
So apparently there are no other questions, so I'll take advantage of the microphone to ask you a question myself. Now, as you have argued in your writings, Professor Friedman, the United States over the past 30 years have not really played a positive role as regards both the political and economic situation of the world. And now we're about to have a crucial vote in the United States, and this could mean fundamental change in the United States. So if you gaze in the crystal ball, what kind of future do you see for the United States? And then a second question, you are not certainly a fanatic supporter of big government, but you do recognize that the state has a positive role to play. What could therefore the role of public policies be in a context of globalization where states have increasing problems in legiferating and legislating and in controlling? And what could public policies do positively in order to introduce a restart of growth and of the positive results of growth, obviously?
Well, let me not pretend to be a political scientist. I'm an economist, so I will skip the part of your question about looking at the election and the possible post-election future. You know, there's this. Are Agatha Christie films popular in Italy as well? You know, the Hercule Poirot. Is this something that people know about here? You know, Hercule Poirot is this detective in the Agatha Christie films, and in almost all of the stories, there's always a point at which it's always a woman of a certain age who comes up to Monsieur Poirot and says, Monsieur Poirot, vous êtes français? And he looks very abashed and he says, oh, no, madame, I am merely a Belgian. Well, I am merely an economist, so I'm going to skip the part of the question that requires a political scientist. But what I will do is address the part of your question that's about economic policy. My sense is that in many countries, certainly including my own, but not limited to my own, probably the most important policy step that could be taken in the vein of the discussion we're having this afternoon is to intervene in the educational process of very young children. I would point to Ellen Krueger, who was here before and whose work I recommend on this subject, but he's not here at the moment. But Krueger and other people have studied the educational process in many countries and have discovered that especially in the advanced countries today, the greatest opportunity for achieving gains in students' ability to become productive members of society and also productive members of the labor force is to focus on two cuts. First, to focus on children who are as young as possible. In the United States, we have government-sponsored programs, albeit at a very small scale, that often start as early as 3 years old. And second, to focus on those students who, for reasons having nothing to do with their own efforts or interests, but rather because of the families from which they come, are most at risk of not taking advantage of the educational opportunities that other children will use to their benefit. So there's an age dimension along which to cut, and secondly, there's a dimension that is correlated with income, but not perfectly so. By intervening in a positive way in the education experience of these so-called at-risk children, and moreover by doing so at an extremely young age, public policy is achieving two things. First, by moving children who will then become students, who will then become workers, from the extreme left tail of the productivity distribution toward and perhaps to the middle of the distribution, policy is making for a more productive labor force in the aggregate and therefore contributing to the growth of the economy as a whole. But second, because the policy is also moving people from the extreme left tail of the distribution into or toward the center, policy is at the very same time making the distribution more egalitarian, not just in terms of outcomes, but remember, we're talking about 3-year-old children, people who can't possibly be held morally responsible for the fact that they're not ready to learn. And so regardless of whether one wants to look at equality issues from the perspective of egalitarianism of outcomes or of opportunities, there clearly is a pro-egalitarian consequence of the policy as well. Now, I don't think this is the right way to go for in the developing world. From what I've seen, the developing world, where people by and large are not even getting primary educations, much less secondary, has a different set of issues. But once economies get to the point at which the great majority of citizens at least have a secondary education, then my sense of the evidence is that that would be the single recommendation that I would highlight as the one that's most positive both for the economy as a whole and also for the shape of the distribution.
Moltissime grazie al professor Benjamin Friedman.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Benjamin Friedman. And so you're a great economist, not a Belgian, to quote Agatha Christie, and enjoy the rest of the festival.